Chapter 19 of a Strange Disappearance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. A Strange Disappearance by Anna Katharine Green. Chapter 19. Explanations. "I cannot endure this," came in one burst of feeling from the lips of Mr. Blake. "She don't know, she don't realise, sir," cried he suddenly, becoming conscious of my presence in the room. "Will you be good enough to see that this note," he hastily scribbled one, "is carried across the way to my house and given to Mrs. Daniels?" I bowed assent, routed up one of the men in the next room, and dispatched it at once. "Perhaps she will listen to the voice of one of her own sex, if not to me," said he, and began pacing the floor of the narrow room in which we were, with a wildness of impatience that showed to what depths had sunk the hope of gaining his lovely woman for his own. Feeling myself no longer necessary in that spot, I followed where my wishes led, and entered the room where Luttra was bidding good-bye to her father. "I shall never forget," I heard her say as I crossed the floor to where Mr. Gryce stood looking out of the window, "that your blood runs in my veins together with that of my gentle-hearted, never to be forgotten mother. Whatever my fate may be, or wherever I may hide the head you have bowed to the dust, be sure I shall always lift up my hands in prayer for your repentance, and return to an honest life. God grant that my prayers may be heard, and that I may yet receive at your hands a father's kindly blessing." The only answer to this was a heavily muttered growl that gave but little promise of any such peaceful termination to a deeply vicious life. Hearing it, Mr. Gryce hastened to procure his men, and remove the hardened wretches from the spot. All through the preparations for their departure, she stood and watched their sullen faces with a wild yearning in her eye that could scarcely be denied. But when the door finally closed upon them, and she was left standing there with no one in the room but myself, she steadied herself up as one who is conscious that all the storms of heaven are about to break upon her, and turning slowly to the door, waited with arms crossed and a still determination upon her brow, the coming of the feet of him whose resolve she felt must have, as yet, been only strengthened by her resistance. She had not long to wait. Almost with the closing of the street door upon the detectives and their prisoners, Mr. Blake, followed by Mrs. Daniels and another lady, whose thick veil and long cloak but barely concealed the patrician features and stately form of the Countess de Mirac, entered the room. The surprise had its effect. Luttra was evidently for the moment thrown off her guard. "Mrs. Daniels," she breathed, holding out her hands with a longing gesture. "My dear mistress," returned that good woman, taking those hands in hers, but in a respectful way that proved the constraint imposed upon her by Mr. Blake's presence. "Do I see you again and safe?" "You must have thought I cared little for the anxiety you would be sure to feel," said that fair young mistress, gazing with earnestness into the glad but tearful eyes of the housekeeper. "But, indeed, I have been in no position to communicate with you, nor could I do so without risking that to protect which I so outraged my feelings as to leave the house at all. I mean the life and welfare of its master, Mrs. Daniels." "Ah, what is that?" quoth Mr. Blake. "It was to save me you consented to follow them." "Yes, what else would have led me to such an action? They might have killed me. I would not have cared. but when they began to utter threats against you—" "Mrs. Blake!" exclaimed Mrs. Daniels, catching hold of her mistress's uplifted hand, and pointing to a scar that slightly disfigured her white arm a little above the wrist. "Mrs. Blake, what's that?" A pink flush, the first I had seen on her usually pale countenance, rose for an instant to her cheeks, and she seemed to hesitate. "It was not there when I last saw you, Mrs. Blake." "No," was the slow reply. "I found myself forced that night to inflict upon myself a little wound. It is nothing. Let it go." "No, Luttra, I cannot let it go," said her husband, advancing towards her with something like gentle command. "I must hear not only about this, but all the other occurrences of that night. How came they to find you in the refuge you had attained?" "I think," said she in a low tone, the underlying suffering of which it would be hard to describe, "that it was not to seek me they first invaded your house. They had heard you were a rich man, and the sight of that ladder running up the side of the new extension was too much for them. Indeed, I know that it was for purposes of robbery they came, for they had hired this room opposite you some days previous to making the attempt. You see they were almost destitute of money, and though they had some buried in the cellar of the old house in Vermont, they dared not leave the city to procure it. My brother was obliged to do so later, however. It was a surprise to them seeing me in your house. They had reached the roof of the extension and were just lifting up the corner of the shade I had dropped across the open window. I always open my window a few minutes before preparing to retire, when I rose from the chair in which I had been brooding, and turned up the gas. I was combing my hair at the time, and so of course they recognized me. Instantly they gave a secret signal I, alas, remembered only too well, and crouching back bade me put out the light that they might enter with safety. I was at first too much startled to realize the consequence of my action, and with some vague idea that they had discovered my retreat and come for purposes of advice or assistance, I did what they bid. Immediately they threw back the shade and came in, their huge figures looming frightfully in the faint light made by a distant gas lamp in the street below. "What do you want?" were my first words uttered in a voice I scarcely recognized for my own. "Why do you steal on me like this in the night, and through an open window 50 feet from the ground? Aren't you afraid you will be discovered and sent back to the prison from which you have escaped?" Their reply sent a chill through my blood and awoke me to a realization of what I had done in this allowing two escaped convicts to enter a house not my own. "We want money, and we're not afraid of anything now you are here." And without heeding my exclamation of horror, they coolly told me that they would wait where they were till the household was asleep, when they would expect me to show them the way to the silver closet, or, what was better, the safe or wherever it was Mr. Blake kept his money. I saw they took me for a servant, as indeed I was, and for some minutes I managed to preserve that position in their eyes. But when in a sudden burst of rage at my refusal to help them, they pushed me aside and hurried to the door with the manifest intention of going below, I forgot prudence in my fears and uttered some wild appeal to them not to do injury to any one in the house, for it was my husband's. Of course that disclosure had its natural effect. They stopped, but only to beset me with questions till the whole truth came out. I could not have committed a worse folly than thus taking them into my confidence. Instantly the advantages to be gained by using my secret connection with so wealthy a man